Buonasera a tutte e tutti. Iniziamo questa serata con la professoressa Barbara Oakley con un video che la presenta e poi interverrà il prorettore alla terza missione per...
Barbara Oakley is a fireball in the field of learning and teaching.
Yeah, Barbara's work is cutting edge because of the way that she...
Technical problems.
Barbara Oakley is a fireball in the field of learning and teaching.
Yeah, Barbara's work is cutting edge because of the way that she connects modern insights from neuroscience to very doable things.
She's an effective communicator. That's what makes her an astonishingly effective educator to millions of students, from CEOs to college students to deeply disadvantaged populations like refugees.
With our book, Learning How to Learn, Barbara and I have reached over 3.5 million people in over 200 countries and ages 10 to 90.
When I was a kid, I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. I enlisted in the Army, and I went to the Defense Language Institute, successfully learned a new language. So I thought, if I could learn a language well, maybe that meant that I could also learn in math and science. One day, one of my students found out about my sordid past as a math flunky, and he said, "How'd you do it? How'd you change your brain?" I realized, no, wait a minute, I should put this down. So I wrote a book. It sold over 1 million copies. And then I heard about these things called MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. That is what's really going to reach the people we really most want to reach. Researchers have found that we have two fundamentally different modes of thinking. We're going to use an analogy of the game of pinball to help us understand these.
I think that's part of her greatness, making something that's really hard to understand and turn it into metaphors.
I think that what Barbara and I have done is to provide access to information about the brain to a much broader community.
One of the world's largest universities in Turkey is 1.5 million students. They're looking to begin using Learning How to Learn to onboard all of their students.
The leader of our monastery wanted me to help to transform the education system at our monastic college. He wanted some kind of learning methodology that was rooted in neuroscientific data. The real struggles that we have as learners are so universal. Everyone involved was able to gain real valuable insights for their own personal lives as learners and as instructors.
It's really difficult to change the direction of education to become more aligned with good, solid, evidence-based research. And that's what I am most proud of. What people often don't realize is that learning is deeply tied to our ability to live to our full potential.
She has been driven to reach out to the rest of the world to help us to be better learners, to be better citizens, and to have a fulfilled life.
From our perspective, Barbara's not only helping us in this lifetime, she's also helping us in future lifetimes.
You're helping students to feel better about their lives, and you're helping society itself to have a higher, sort of a happier underpinning.
Bene, questo era il video che presentava la La nostra oratrice di stasera è vincitrice del prestigiosissimo premio McGraw per l'Education. Ora la parola al delegato del Magnifico Rettore, il professor Pierandrea Serra, delegato alla terza missione.
Grazie professor Ruggero. Innanzitutto è per me un piacere essere qua con voi, vi ringrazio per la partecipazione e ringrazio gli organizzatori di questo evento, in particolare il professor Ruggero e la dottoressa Oakley, che ci onora della sua presenza. Porto i saluti del Magnifico Rettore, che sarebbe dovuto essere presente, ma per un impegno improvviso non è riuscito ad essere dei nostri. E comunque condivide sia l'approccio che ovviamente la necessità di fornire nuovi strumenti per l'apprendimento. Oltre che salutarvi, ovviamente augurare buon lavoro, vi porto 2 secondi, se me lo consentite, non nel ruolo, in questo caso di prorettore della terza missione, ma di quello che era il mio lavoro originale, che lo è di neuroscienziato, perché quello che sentirete oggi è molto basato sugli studi neurobiologici. Io ho avuto il piacere negli Stati Uniti di essere allievo del professor Giulio Tononi e della professoressa Cirelli, che si sono occupati di sonno e di coscienza, si occupano tuttora, per cui abbiamo avuto il modo di affrontare anche il ruolo delle reti neurali e soprattutto dei pattern cognitivi per quanto riguarda poi la gestione del cervello e del tempo, perché sembra che il cervello sia una risorsa infinita, ma in realtà così non è. Infatti è molto interessante l'approccio neurobiologico, io in particolare mi occupo di dopamina e noradrenalina come sistemi di switching dell'attenzione, ma è importante anche un aspetto che probabilmente la professoressa tratterà, mi stava dicendo, che è anche il ruolo per esempio del sonno nel consolidamento ad esempio della memoria. Un concetto, vi riporto adesso, che è molto innovativo, ma giusto per dare un mio piccolo contributo anche alla discussione, che proprio è stato scoperto in Wisconsin, nel centro del sonno, da Chiara Cirelli e Giulio Tononi, è il concetto di local sleep. Quando ci addormentiamo, noi pensiamo che il cervello si addormenti tutto assieme, in realtà si addormenta a macchia di leopardo e le aree che si addormentano prima sono quelle che sono state più utilizzate nell'arco della giornata. Cosa è? Questa è la base neurobiologica del perché non possiamo studiare per 6 ore una stessa materia, fare una scorpacciata, ma dobbiamo studiare per un tempo limitato materie differenziate, ma poi ritornarci sopra per consolidare i ricordi. Quindi il ruolo da un lato della memoria, ma anche del dimenticare alcuni aspetti che sono un po' alla base. Sarò molto interessato, mi siederò in prima fila per sentire la lezione della dottoressa Oakley e soprattutto speriamo che sia l'inizio di un insieme di incontri, per questo ringrazio il professor Ruggero, che hanno un grosso significato per la gestione del tempo e per la professionalizzazione dei docenti, ma anche per gli studenti ovviamente, che devono sapere che anche il tempo e l'utilizzo delle loro risorse, in questo caso cerebrali, è un qualcosa che va studiato, programmato, da un punto di vista anche di approccio, non improvvisato. Grazie e buon lavoro.
Grazie Pierandrea. Vi chiederete come mai un ex direttore del Dipartimento di Agraria ha invitato la professoressa Oakley. Ve lo dico alla fine magari. Adesso intanto sentiamo quello che ci ha da dire lei. The floor is yours.
Okay. Great. And speak from over there, if that's all right.
Mi muoverò, mi metto accanto alla presentazione. Sono veramente felice di essere qua, è un vero onore. Devo dire che la Sardegna è una terra straordinaria, un'isola straordinaria. Voi siete veramente molto fortunati e io sono molto fortunata oggi ad essere qui. Vorrei iniziare mostrandovi qualcosa che diciamo, potrebbe essere interessante anche per voi da replicare nel vostro lavoro. Adesso quest'uomo ci mostrerà una serie di numeri e vedete se riuscite a fare le addizioni in questo.
用就早下要一个啊。 はい、スタート。はい、答えを見せてください。はい、ただいまの答えは、5400。
È incredibile, vero? Anche voi sperate vi piacerebbe riuscire a fare quello che hanno appena fatto questi ragazzi, vero? Vediamo come hanno fatto questi bambini a risolvere il problema. Vediamo però anche una cosa estremamente interessante, un gioco giapponese chiamato Shiritori. Questo gioco consiste nell'utilizzare delle categorie di simboli, ad esempio c'è qui il kanji per la mela, che è presente anche nella parola gorilla, quindi c'è uno schema che segue il gioco, e la sfida è quella di trovare una parola che inizia con la sillaba con cui finisce la parola precedente. Guardiamo queste bambine, quello che fanno giocando. Problema tecnico. Okay, you can go.
Okay. It has to play the next slide. I can't. I press it and it won't go. Okay. Okay. So now let's watch. Okay. So they're going to play 2 games at once.
しりとり、リンゴ、ゴリラ、ラッパ、パンダ、ダチョウ、牛、鹿、カラス、
Look at how much fun they're having.
カメ、目玉焼き。
You stop the slide.
17,602.
So they can tell, they can add the numbers at the same time that they're playing this verbal game. How do they do this? These are the kinds of questions we're going to talk about and hopefully answer in this presentation, because the brain is capable of extraordinary feats of learning. And if we learn a little bit about how the brain learns, we can actually tap into some of this power. So one thing you should know, the World Economic Forum has, for many years, they have developed and put out a list of the top 10 skills that you need to thrive today, during today's environment. They put out a list in 2015. If you look at that list, the word learning does not appear on this list. That seems strange. Let's look at 2020. If you look at the list for 2020, the word learning does not appear. But let's look at the top 10 skills that are thought to be needed for 2025. Guess what? learning suddenly appears, and it's at the right toward the very top of the list. And why is this? Part of it is Andreas Schlichter went to University of California, San Diego, and he learned about some of the popular approaches that Terry Sinowski and I take towards teaching about how to learn effectively. He realized how many millions of people are interested in this. Now the World Economic Forum is focusing in that this is really an important skill. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking at schools, at businesses, but particularly schools, to see if you are teaching students how to learn. Not just what to learn, but how to learn. Can you imagine, like, we give children 12 to 16 years of education and never give them a course on how to learn. It's very strange. In 20, 30 years, this will not happen. People will be like, of course, we've always had courses on how to learn effectively. But what is effective learning? Before I talk about that, what I'd like to do is give you a little sense of my own background. So I'm from the United States. I grew up moving all over the United States. And actually, by the time I was about 15 years old, I'd lived in 10 different places. Now, when I was a little girl, 7 years old, we lived here in Texas, and we moved to Massachusetts. Suddenly, they were far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. The problem is that mathematics, it can be really, really easy to fall off anywhere along the way when you're learning math. I fell off when I was 7 years old because we moved. But there are many reasons that people fall off the math track. So I gave up on learning math. I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is a little ironic because I am speaking with you here today as a distinguished professor of engineering, and I love math and science. So what happened? How did my brain change? I will give you a little background on that. One day, one of my engineering students asked me, he found out about my terrible past as a math flunky, and he said, how did you change your brain? And I thought back on it. I mean, my father was it's making it so. Okay, so there's my father, and he was a veterinarian. So I love animals as well. He specialized in cattle, and he joined the military, or rejoined after World War II, as a veterinarian, and moved around and did more things. But I was very lucky in that when I grew up, I was around animals. I loved animals. And I thought, what can I be when I grow up? Because I love animals, I love knitting, weaving. I can't do anything mathematical or analytical. I don't have those skills. So what I wanted to do, I mean, what is the word for a person who speaks 2 languages in English? Bilingual. What's the word for a person who speaks 1 language? It's an American, right? So I didn't want to be like typical Americans. I didn't want to just always only speak 1 language. I wanted to be more like the Europeans who can often speak multiple languages. But I I wasn't around people who spoke other languages. I couldn't afford to go to college. So I found out, though, there was a way to learn a language and actually get paid for it. And that was to join the Army. So that's me. I am looking really nervous, about to throw a grenade. If you knew how clumsy I am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language. Clearly, it should have been Italian. But randomly, I picked the language Russian. So I learned how to speak Russian. I ended up working as a translator on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea during the 1980s. So my shipmates would come to me and they'd say, "Do you know what your president said about us today?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay." But I learned a lot of Russian. And when I have something to drink, it begins to come back to me. So, but the thing is, I love having new perspectives and seeing the world through different lenses. So I love adventure. I also ended up then at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that is where I met my husband. So I like to say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet this wonderful man, and he is still my hero after 40 years, so I'm a very lucky woman. But the thing is, I did everything people told me to do. I followed my passion, I learned a subject really well, and then when it came time to get a job, no one was interested in my Slavic languages and literature skills. But everyone was interested in my friends who were engineers, West Point engineers, who'd had some good technical background. So I thought, why don't I see if I can add a new skill to my skill set and also learn in math and science. So it was very beneficial for me to learn another language, although I wish I had picked Italian. But it also, as I came to find out, was beneficial to not just blindly follow my passions, but to broaden my passions. So at age 26, I went to the university, started with the lowest possible level of high school algebra, and began to slowly climb my way upwards. It was not easy, but if I had known then what I know now about how to learn effectively, I could have made it much, much easier. So that's what I want to share with you here today, are ideas and insights from neuroscience, from cognitive psychology, about how to learn effectively. Because there's ways to study where you spend a full day when you could have spent only an hour or two and gotten the same insights. So, what is learning? If you think about it, the brain is really complicated, but it has a fundamental building block, which is the neuron. And I love looking at you because you see this and you go, oh, this is where she gets to the really boring scientific part of the talk. So let's spice it up a little bit. We're going to use a metaphor or an analogy for a neuron to better help us more easily understand the ideas of what a neuron does. So our analogy is a space alien. And in this case, you can see our space alien has 3 legs. Those are analogous to what are called dendrites in a real neuron. And then there's these little toes on the neuron, or on these dendrites, and those are called dendritic spines. Now, these dendritic spines are really important, and you'll see them again and again through this presentation. And lastly, you've got like an arm that reaches upwards, and that is called an axon. So what neurons do is they like to sort of reach out and tickle the toe of a neighboring neuron. And what they're really doing is they are sending signals. So those signals are mostly electrical. They jump this little synapse gap right here, and it's oh, it's a touchscreen monitor, so when I touch it, it stops. Live and learn, okay. So you saw how that mostly electrical signal came down and jumped the gap with neurotransmitters, traveled to the next neuron. And what's really happening is these neurons, as you're learning something, are connecting together through these signals. So I show 5 neurons that are kind of connecting together. But the reality is that when you're learning something, there's a big cluster of neurons that have a connecting signal as you're learning these. So this is whether you're learning how to take a derivative in math, how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language, how to do a dance step, how to play a certain chord on the guitar. Whatever you're learning, you are simply making connections between neurons in long-term memory. Unfortunately, for decades, we have heard from some educators, well-intentioned but wrong, that you don't need to remember things because you can always look it up. Would I be able to speak Italian if I always just looked it up on Google Scholar? You have to have those links of learning within your own mind, within your own brain, if you are to develop expertise in anything. So it is really fundamentally important that you get those connections within your brain and you're not just looking it up. Sometimes people will say, oh, I can just use a calculator. I don't need to remember how to, what the multiplication tables are. But if you, as a child, don't learn the multiplication tables, you also do not develop a natural feel for the numbers and the relationships between them. So how do you strengthen those connections? You just practice. Practice, as it turns out, is one of the best ways to build those connections. So what happens when you don't practice? Metaphorically speaking, you can kind of think of it as, let's say a student is trying to learn something. They go to class, they pay attention, they go home, they're busy, they don't look at the material for 3 weeks. Then, the night before a big test, they look at the material and realize they can't remember it. What has happened in the meantime? If you look here, you can see it's almost as if your little synaptic janitors have swept away those connections and made it so that it's, you don't have those links of learning anymore. So ultimately, as you're learning, those links that you create and you practice with become stronger and richer, and they're easier for you to pull to mind whenever you might need them. Now, I should mention something. Throughout this seminar, notice how I gave the neuron, and then I gave a metaphor or an analogy for the neuron, which was the space alien. In fact, using a metaphor or analogy is one of the most powerful teaching tools that you can use. It takes information you already know and uses it to help build new information much more easily. So in this case, you can see if you already know how water flows, everybody kind of knows how water flows. You think it's very simple, but actually when you were a baby and a toddler, you played a lot with water to figure out how water flows. But once you get that concept, you can more easily use it as a bridge to talk about things like electrical current flow. Now, eventually, you know that you have a metaphor for something like water and electrical current flow, and it's a good metaphor, but ultimately, it does break down. If you look at electrical current flow at a quantum level, it's not like water flow. But whenever a metaphor breaks down, you can throw it away and get a new metaphor. But good luck finding a new metaphor for quantum physics. That's a toughie. So now I have a new question for you. I would like to ask you, what is the most powerful technique for students to help students learn efficiently? I'm going to give you 4 different options, and after I present those 4 options, we will go back over them and have a vote. So some of you may know the answer, but we will see. Okay, so the most powerful technique, is it rereading? I did a lot of rereading when I was learning in engineering. Or is it highlighting or underlining? Perhaps it's retrieval practice or recall, which is like when you use a flashcard to see if you can retrieve information. Or is it creating a concept map, which is drawing out all the key concepts and relating them? So we have 4 options now. And what I would like you to do is vote 1 vote only. There is one of these approaches that is by far the best, better than any of the others. So how many, she said carefully, avoiding touching the screen, how many vote for rereading? Okay, a few, 1, okay. Highlighting and underlining. I still do that a lot, yeah. Okay, so we've got some. How about retrieval practice? Okay, we've got some. And concept map. Okay, so the bulk of people are concept map. Okay, are you ready for the solution? Okay, it is retrieval practice. It is by far better than concept mapping. But you might say, but my teachers have told me that concept mapping is the best. But they never went to study it. And in fact, when a big paper was published by Jeff Karpicki in 2012, comparing these 4 techniques, this one is by far the best, much better than concept mapping. So why is that? If you look, when you are first learning something, you've got this initial learning, like right now, you're learning maybe some new ideas, And you get these weak links that are laid in mind when you're first learning something. But each time you retrieve it from your own mind, you are strengthening those sets of links. Concept mapping is really a lot like taking notes. Well, taking notes isn't what's helpful. It's reviewing your notes and trying to see if you can retrieve the key ideas of your notes from your own memory. That's retrieval practice. So, but some people will say, but it's teaching other people. That is the best way to learn something, is to teach others. I think most of us would agree. But what is teaching other people? It's retrieval practice, exactly. So in fact, most of the ways that we think of as really being helpful in learning involve retrieving that information. So what is the first thing we often do as teachers when we start a class? So we've taught the previous week's material, we're starting the new week, and we say, last week, here's what we covered, to bring students' minds back to what they were talking about. But guess what? Why don't you turn that around? Instead of saying, here's what we covered, ask students to write down, what did we cover last week? Ask them to retrieve the key ideas. This is what will help this kind of thing glue in memory much better. An excellent book is called Powerful Teaching by Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bain, and it gives you many retrieval practice ideas. But we have found from research that there's hundreds and hundreds of papers that show that retrieval practice is by far the best way to learn effectively. And the more we can use this in our classes, the better. People will make the mistake, teachers sometimes will think, oh, it's just simple memorization. It's just rote learning. But it is not at all. You are retrieving the key concept, you're creating it in your mind, and you're learning it better. And in fact, that's what research shows. Retrieval practice builds conceptual understanding far better than any other method. So it helps you remember, it also helps you with conceptual understanding. So here's just one of my favorite sort of retrieval practice. It's a website called I Do Recall, and you can build your own flashcards with this website and grade yourself. You can upload your book notes from electronic books and create flashcards quite easily from it. So I really like this particular website. It also, you can not only build flashcards that way, but you can also upload like PDFs, and this will show in just a moment. Here's a PDF that's uploaded, and you can use that to create your own flashcards. You can also, for example, use or input YouTube videos from your favorite YouTube stars, create really nice flashcards from that. So it's a really, I think it's a great system. Also, you can use this groups feature to use this with your classes. So that's, I Do Recall, but there's also very many other popular websites. Kahoot, I just had learned There's a professor here who is using Kahoot to create some great flashcards for her classes, or have her students creating these. Quizlet is also very popular. Anki is the old standby. But it's also, you can do anything with Anki, but it's also really a little bit hard to learn, just because it's so comprehensive. If you have live in-class online, use Nearpod or Pear Deck, and what these will do is you can put retrieval questions and see the whole class's answer at one time. So these are great apps. So you are all budding neuroscientists now, and you might be able to tell that this is actually a dendrite from a neuron, the leg of that neuron. So we've got the dendrite coming out. These are the dendritic spines. This is before learning and before sleep. So this is a living neuron before learning and before sleep. So what we're going to see below here is that same living neuron after learning and after sleep. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that the neuron is going to get thicker? I mean, the dendrite leg is going to be thicker? Am I trying to trick you? I'm very good at tricking people, so everyone is very quiet. Okay, so this is before learning, before sleep. Now, this is after learning and after sleep. And if you look, so look at the head of this dendritic spine and look up above. It had a very small little head. I mean, it didn't really have one at all. But now it's pronounced, it's very large. And here, there's a new dendritic spine that wasn't even there before. So as it turns out, both learning and sleep are incredibly important for the learning process. So what happens is, during sleep, the brain sends signals on those pathways over and over again, and those are what help build those neural connections. Now you might say, why aren't you showing the other neuron that this is connecting to? But the thing is, it's really hard to image living neurons. So just getting one living neuron before learning and before sleep, and after learning, after sleep, that's a really big deal. So we will forgive the neuroscientists for not having a big network that they're showing us all of these things, because what the work they've already done is really quite remarkable. Now, this also gives us a little bit of an insight into how we can help our students to better learn material. So one thing you can do is be very careful. Put it to your students like this. During the day, do your studying just as you normally would. But at night, in those 2 minutes before you go to sleep, draw to mind, retrieve the key idea you're trying to learn, remember, or understand. And so just those 2 minutes before you go to sleep. This will signal the brain, there's something important about this. And those are some of the pathways it will preferentially, hopefully, practice with during sleep. Hundreds of times it will send signals that are related to what you're learning, and it will help to make connections so that when you wake up in the morning, that concept you were struggling with suddenly becomes clear. It is the consolidation process precisely that we heard about earlier. So, sleep is a really important part of learning, and students often just think, I can skip the sleep, right? But actually that's where it really builds the understanding. And this brings me to something that is related to retrieval practice, which is a concept called spaced repetition. And that means spacing out your learning. So if you're learning and you have 5 hours in a week, perhaps you might devote 1 hour one day, another hour the next day. What happens? You study for an hour, that night you go to sleep, you build, you consolidate, you connect. The next day you study for an hour, you go to sleep. It's almost like you're getting far more power because you're spacing out your learning than if you did something like this, where you just did 5 hours in one day, which creates a weak set of links that's much easier to sweep away. So again, I love my metaphors, and so a good metaphor is building a brick wall. Lay a layer of bricks, mortar, bricks, mortar. It takes time to build a nice wall. If you don't take that time, though, you just cram everything quickly, you have a very poor foundation for learning. So it is important to take your time in learning. It helps us to think about weightlifting. This guy did not sit down the night before a big meet and say, oh, I'm going to work out tonight, I'm going to cram, and I'm going to become a world champion. It doesn't work that way with sports. It takes time. We can look at the muscles and say, oh, it's going to take time for that person. But we can't look inside the brain. So even though both muscular tissue and neural tissue are excitable tissue that takes time to develop, we think we can just cram and learn it all in one evening. But that's not true. Just like building a muscular structure, it takes time to build a good neural structure. So related to this is the idea that exercise is profoundly important. And you may say, well, what does this have to do with the brain? Exercise is like moving the body. Well, we have known for decades that if you exercise, it helps build your ability to learn and remember. But nobody knew why. But now, in recent years, we have found that when you exercise, the brain produces a substance called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is how it's abbreviated. So I'm going to show you, this again is a dendrite, that leg of the neuron. So if you think about it, what happens when we exercise? It produces BDNF, and here is what BDNF can do in the brain. It's sort of, they, in essence, kind of metaphorically sprinkled BDNF on neurons, and watch what happens. When you apply BDNF, look, it's like all these dendritic spines just pop out and say, learn me something. I am ready to go. I'm so excited. Please just make those connections for me. So exercise is profoundly, it really helps to produce the connections that can easily be made as we're trying to learn something. Will it make you a super genius? No. If it did, then every sports athlete star would be a super genius. But it will help you to live to your potential as far as being able to learn and think about things more intelligently. Have you ever noticed sometimes you feel like your thinking's very cloudy, it's hard to concentrate? That can sometimes have to do with the fact that you may not have a good exercise program. So we're going to cover one little topic here, and then you get a little break. So, as it turns out, let's think about the brain from, let's think about a bird. What are the main challenges for a bird to stay alive? It's got to peck and be able to focus on a seed, but it's also got to be able to think more broadly, like to watch for predators. So it's thought that we have two hemispheres, perhaps because we have the separate need to focus, but also, so that often seems to be left hemisphere, centered. But we also have this need to be more broadly aware of what's around us. So that can be whole brain sort of things. So this has to do with two different modes that we've found in how the brain learns. So we've got focus, and which is focusing on the seed or focusing on your schoolwork, and diffuse, which is mind wandering. So to understand this, we can use a metaphor. And the metaphor we can use is that of a pinball machine. So if we, do you all remember how pinball machines work? Yeah, okay. So you just pull back on a plunger, a ball goes around, that's how you get points. So I'm going to put this pinball machine right on a human brain. Are you ready for it? Okay, here goes. Okay, there's the pinball machine on the brain. This is an analogy for focus mode. So focus mode, let's say I ask you to focus and solve the multiplication problem 23 times 42. So your brain says, okay, I'll say 23 times 42. You might write it out with a pencil and paper. Some of you can do it in your head. It's all related to the patterns that your brain works in because you've already learned how to multiply. But what happens when you're learning something completely new that you don't have the patterns for yet? So let's say you are learning division. So you're learning division, you're 9 years old, you already know multiplication. So you're trying to lay some new pathways, but your mind, your thoughts keep slithering up to multiplication because it's familiar. And you find you can't solve that problem. So you try, and you get more and more frustrated because you can't solve that problem because you don't have the patterns yet in your brain. So you close the book, you walk away, and your mind gradually gets off of this, and here's what happens. Your brain, your thinking can fall into that diffuse mode where your thoughts range much more widely. So as it goes into this diffuse mode, you're actually thinking, although you're not aware of it, your brain is working on this problem. And later, when you return to the problem you were stuck on, suddenly it makes sense. So we know that the two different modes, focus mode is called by psychologists task positive network. Diffuse mode is called by psychologists task negative network, or neuroscientists might call the diffuse mode the default mode network. Now, so what learning involves, it seems, is that you go back and forth between focused and diffuse modes. You cannot be in both modes at the same time on the same topic. You're always going back and forth. Well, there's one way you can be in both modes at the same time, and that is to take certain forms of mushrooms, but I'm not advocating that here, so, okay. So anyway, back and forth you go. We always thought before the only way you learn is when you focus, but actually when you are mind wandering and relaxing, there is also work taking place in the background. So what I'd like you to do is let's take a little break here. So I'd like you to introduce yourselves, and so, you know, find a person, one or two, that you don't know, hopefully, that is near where you're sitting, and get into a group of maybe 2, 3, 4 people, and introduce yourselves, and I'd like you to describe the difference between focused and diffuse modes. Take about 5 minutes, relax, and on your mark, get set, go. All righty. Yes. So, what's that? My okay. So I have a question for you. Are there any questions from you? I am welcoming questions. So let's see. I want you to take 1 minute, turn to your neighbor, and figure out, do you have a question? So, Mark, get set. 1 minute, turn to your neighbor, and brainstorm. Come up with a question. You didn't realize you would have an assignment, did you? Okay, so does anyone brave enough now to volunteer a question that you might have gotten while you were speaking? Yes.
Altrimenti non vi sentono in streaming.
Okay. I've got your books.
Oh, great. Okay.
Okay. Many times students, especially when they are big, young students, but like at university, they think they don't need a method. They can already study. How can we convince them that they need to know this important information so that they can be better, they can learn much better?
Oh, so this is a brilliant question. She says that how do we convince students that they need to learn about how to learn effectively, because many students believe they already know how to learn effectively. In fact, what research has shown, the worse the student, the better they think they can learn. And it's a very strange thing. So this is called illusions of competence in learning. And sometimes the best way to do it is to let a student fail. But there are other ways as well. A good thing to do, when you start a class, talk about retrieval practice. What is it? Why is it important? Why are you asking them to remember things? One thing you can, so if you explain one little thing, a piece about how the brain works, and talk about why you're doing a certain thing in class, and then you remind students over and over again, that can be valuable in allowing them to begin to understand that, yes, there are techniques that can help them. Also, if you explain that they can spend 10 hours on a weekend learning something and doing very poorly, And there are ways to do it in much less time and learn better. So they have more time to party or to have fun. If you explain it is an advantage for them to learn a few of these techniques because it will save them time in studying, that can also be valuable. So these are a few ideas. Of course, when they get their first test back, it can be a good idea to have your first little test, a quiz, early in the semester, so they have a chance to fail early, and then they become more receptive to your guidance. So very good question. Any other questions? Okay, so let us move on to, we have our magician here, Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about ADHD, dopamine. If you have students with attentional challenges, so they can't pay attention very easily, often this relates to the dopamine genetics. And what is going on is those students, it's almost like they have more holes in their focus mode that fall, so it's more easily, or it's easier for them to fall into diffuse mind-wandering thinking. So, but that's also a mode where there's much creativity. So they can't help it, but it also, you can kind of see what's really going on is they can fall, even though they don't want to, into mind-wandering mode. So let's talk a little bit about students' worst challenge in education, and that is procrastination. I can give you all the learning techniques in the world, but if you can't get a student to sit down in the first place to learn because they're procrastinating, all bets are off. So why do we procrastinate? It turns out that when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it activates the pain centers in the brain, the insular cortex, and that's, because we experience pain, we stop thinking about certain things. So we can think about homework we don't want to do. Or we're teachers, we may think about homework we do not want to grade. So we get an unpleasant feeling in our insular cortex. We turn our attention to something more pleasant, and the result is we feel happier. But we've also just procrastinated. So students can even think that they simply can't learn a topic when actually they can learn a topic very well if they didn't procrastinate. Because when you procrastinate, you have very little time, it's very stressful. Few people can learn under that circumstance. So I'm an engineer now. Let's just go directly to the sort of answer to the problem of procrastination, and that is the Pomodoro technique. I think this brilliant technique is used by industry companies worldwide to help enhance productivity, but it really helps students learn. This was invented by Francesco Cedillo in the 1980s. All you do for this technique is you turn off all distractions, so no cell phones, no pop-ups on your computers, and then you set a timer for 25 minutes. You focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. When you're done, give yourself 5 minutes or so of a reward, which it does not involve picking up your cell phone. Because when you pick up your cell phone, you think, oh, I'm just going to check my text messages. Oh, you have a text message. Well, you want to respond to it. What are you doing? You're going right back into focus mode, and then you're overriding the information you've just been learning about. Remember, we've learned that focus and diffuse are both important elements of learning. So that 5 minutes of relaxing reward, like having a cup of tea, sitting and relaxing and looking out, or simply, walking around a little bit, or sitting, that is that diffuse mode. Did you notice that when we had that little diffuse mode break, didn't you feel within yourself this kind of feeling of, oh, I can relax. She's been talking for a while. I've had to focus on it, and I really want to just turn my brain off for a while. That's what that little break where you turn to one another allowed you to begin going into this diffuse mode. Even 10 to 15 seconds while you're turning to someone else can give you that relaxing feeling of a break. And also when you are talking to someone else, it's much, you're not having to focus intently. You're kind of relaxing, you're conversing, and you're going into diffuse mode. So having these little diffuse mode breaks in your classes can be a very good benefit. Let's say you teach a mathematics course. What is a typical session? 1 hour, 2 hours here? 45 minutes. Oh, okay. So maybe somewhere in the middle of this 45 minutes, and I suspect many of you already do this, you will ask your students, you'll explain something, then you'll ask your students to turn to one another, work a problem, something of that nature, and that's automatically giving them a chance to be in this diffuse mode momentarily. But this is particularly good approach for something like students working at home. And as they're working at home, sometimes what students will like to do is do 4 Pomodoros, each followed by, or the first 3 are followed by 5-minute breaks. The last one is followed by a half-an-hour break. So that's a very good way of making use of 2.5 hours. Those little breaks can help much more than what you might think. Now, I would like to touch on the idea that we all have different sort of underlying neurochemistries. And so what that means is that we kind of have different brains and different ways of thinking about things. So I want to talk about working memory, long-term memory, and octopuses. So what is this about? Working memory, our neuroscientists left. So you can think of it as short-term memory. So that's like things you remember temporarily. Long-term memory is things you remember a long time. So if I asked you to remember 74325, you would probably repeat it to yourself, 74325, to remember it. But that's because it can easily fall out of that temporary working memory. you can kind of think of that working memory as like an octopus in the front of the brain. It can hold about 4 pieces of information. So I like to model it, it's like a quadrupus with 4 arms on it. And the long-term memory, on the other hand, is like a big set of lockers that are scattered around the brain. Within the lockers are all those links that we've created because we've stored information in long-term memory. So this working memory, as you're learning something, it is creating these sets of neural links, and then working memory stores it so that later, when you need that information, it can pull that information from long-term memory where it can use it. So this brings me to our younger daughter, Rachel. So it's a funny thing. We produced the massive open online course for virtually, it was a few $1,000s. And it was really cheap to make this course that is seen by millions all around the world. You might say, how did you produce it so cheaply? Here is a pro tip. Use your family members for bit parts. They will work so cheaply. They will work for food. So this is our daughter. I asked her at the dinner table, would you model for everyone what it feels like when you are first learning to back up a car? So this is Rachel, and she had recently learned to back up a car. She's going to show you what it felt like for her when she was first learning. So watch her little face. It's like, which mirror do I look at? Do I look in the front? Do I look in the back? Oh, which way do I go? Oh, okay. And then off she goes into the ditch. So the problem is, when you're first learning something, you have what's called a heavy cognitive load. So your working memory has all those arms are busy trying to learn the new material. But once you have learned how to back up a car, it's easy. All you have to do is pull to mind that idea, right? And then you've got a light cognitive load. Look, you've even got arms available for other things like, what's playing on the radio, or are my seatbelts fastened? So you've got other memory or you've got other arms on your octopus available for you to think about more than just backing up the car, because it's easy for you. So what we want is for our students to be able to practice enough with what they've learned that for tests, they just kind of come right up, they're taking a test, they say, oh, well, there was this concept that I practiced with, another concept I practiced with, I put them together, and I can solve the problem on the test. But what often can happen with students who have illusions of competence of learning is they will kind of, they come to the test, they sit down, they have not practiced with retrieval practice. They've just read the material over and over again. They think they know it, and they sit to the test, and that's the first time they realize they didn't know the material. It's not there in long-term memory. So what did they do? They come to you as the professor, and they say, I knew the material better than it shows on the test. And then they'll say, I suffer from test anxiety. So what do we instructors do? We say, you should go to the Learning Center and be helped for the anxiety, when in reality, it may have nothing to do with anxiety. It's simply they have not learned good study techniques. So again, if you are explaining to your students about retrieval practice, spaced repetition, what can happen is when they fail their first test and they say, oh, you know, I knew the material better than it shows on the test, you can say, did you practice with retrieval practice? Did you space out your repetition? Did you do lots of practice tests? All of these kinds of things, you know, will make better sense to a student if you've been talking to them all the way along about these issues. But in any case, I talked about the different ways that students learn and remember. Some people, they learn more slowly. So they have a bath of neurochemicals. So for example, I forget things terribly. I forget things. So when I'm learning something, I learn a vocabulary list in the morning. Here's what happens by the evening. I've made all these connections, but they fall away. For other people, though, they learn something in the morning, that's all that happens. They remember virtually everything, or they have a very good memory. So, but here's the interesting thing, though. When that slow learner, I have to practice again, relearn the vocabulary list. But when I do that, my connections look somewhat different than they did before. What this means is I can be more flexible. Have you ever noticed that someone who is really, really smart can often jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they find it very difficult to change their mind? The reason for it is they made those connections. They're very strong, but they don't go away. So they can be very inflexible about what they've decided. So this is a challenge. Is really intelligent people can also be, they can jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they can be inflexible about things. So if you are a slower learner, rejoice, because sometimes you can do things that the faster learner cannot. And let me give you, as I wrap up here, I'd like to tell you about my hero in science, who is a Spaniard named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was a terrible, terrible student. All indications are he had dyslexia, and he also had attentional disorders. So he flunked out of school. He was kicked out of several elementary schools. His father gave up on him and just said, oh, this kid can't learn at all. Do you know that he eventually went on to become a professor of anatomy, this student who's a loser, and then he went on to win the Nobel Prize, but that wasn't enough. He is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. So how is that? He was asked, so, you know, kind of how did a loser like you actually become successful? And he said, I am no genius, and he was not a genius, but he said, I have worked with many geniuses, and the problem with geniuses is they can jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they can find it very difficult to change those underlying dendritic spine connections. They are inflexible. So again, if you are like Santiago Ramon y Cajal, rejoice, because you, like he, can sometimes do things even geniuses cannot, and that can allow you to be successful. So thank you so very much for your attention this evening. It's been a pleasure to share.
Bene, grazie. Avrete capito quindi come mai un professore di agronomia ha invitato Barbara Oakley qui a Sassari. Se non l'avete capito ve lo spiego. Nei 3 anni in cui ho fatto il direttore, il rettore mi ha più volte bacchettato perché noi siamo il peggiore dipartimento dell'Ateneo in termini di efficienza didattica. Essere bacchettati non è mai una cosa piacevole, però determina anche qualche reazione, e tra queste reazioni, insieme a Ilaria Mannazzo, che è qui presente, che ha presieduto faticosamente per 3 anni la commissione didattica e presiedere una commissione didattica di 90 docenti di agraria che non hanno nessuna voglia di cambiare il loro metodo didattico, non è una cosa facile. Abbiamo quindi ingaggiato dei pedagogisti e abbiamo progettato un progetto didattico soprattutto per gli studenti del primo anno, perché noi abbiamo il grosso problema che molti studenti pensano che ad agraria si impari a guidare il trattore e a mungere le pecore, e in realtà ad agraria poi si studia matematica, fisica, chimica, biologia e tante altre materie, quindi molti che arrivano con quella aspettativa si trovano in difficoltà e lasciano, quindi noi perdiamo circa il 50% degli studenti che si iscrivono. D'altra parte, ma questo è un altro problema ancora, non si iscrive ad agraria chi si dovrebbe iscrivere, cioè chi ha la propensione per le materie scientifiche. E quindi ci siamo molto interrogati su questo tema e direi l'interazione con i pedagogisti, in particolare con Giulia che è qui presente, e Giulia Muzzo, è stata molto positiva perché ci ha permesso di analizzare il problema con metodo scientifico dal punto di vista pedagogico. E quindi ci siamo resi conto di quanto sia importante il metodo di studio e lavorare sul metodo di studio soprattutto sugli studenti del primo anno di università, che rispetto al liceo e rispetto agli istituti tecnici, soprattutto quelli professionali, dove imparano a fare le cose ma non a studiare, quindi è un po' un problema. Per cui ecco, abbiamo sperimentato un primo anno una serie di attività che, devo dire, purtroppo sono state seguite soprattutto dagli studenti che ne avevano meno bisogno, però hanno dato tutta una serie di informazioni che hanno permesso poi di riprogettare un secondo anno di iniziative didattiche di cui abbiamo appunto discusso. E facendo queste discussioni con pedagogisti è venuto fuori il bando dei visiting professor. E allora abbiamo detto, ma perché non invitiamo 3 visiting professor, qualcuno che ci possa aiutare a risolvere questi problemi? E appunto Giulia ha fatto il nome di Barbara Oakley, eccola qua. Quindi le siamo particolarmente grati per essere qui con noi. Poi abbiamo condiviso queste idee anche con i nostri colleghi del Dipartimento di Storia e Scienze della Formazione. Stiamo anche lavorando a una scuola per pastori. Voi mi chiederete, ma è esattamente il contrario di quello che hai detto prima. Sì, in effetti, mentre prima capitava che quando non avevi voglia di studiare andavi a fare il pastore, adesso per andare a fare il pastore devi studiare, perché sennò fallisce l'azienda. E quindi abbiamo anche riflettuto con Barbara su questa scuola, perché è molto più difficile insegnare a un pastore a fare il pastore che non a uno studente universitario a fare la matematica. Ecco, questo è il motivo per cui abbiamo invitato Barbara, la ringraziamo moltissimo. Io aggiungo solo una cosa, poi lascio le conclusioni al professor Dettori. Tra le varie cose di cui abbiamo parlato con lei, ce n'è una secondo me molto importante. Nel 2021 l'Ateneo di Sassari ha annunciato che, causa Covid, le lezioni si sarebbero tenute online. Noi abbiamo raddoppiato le matricole, noi ad Agraria. E quindi ci siamo resi conto che esiste una forte domanda di persone che non hanno la possibilità di frequentare, da noi la frequenza è obbligatoria, però devo dire l'esperienza della didattica a distanza fatta da professori abituati a insegnare face to face è stata disastrosa. Abbiamo di fatto avuto grossissime defiance, cioè di quelle matricole ne abbiamo perso tante. Ecco, invece appunto parlando proprio con Barbara è venuto fuori come si possa fare della didattica a distanza usando delle nuove tecniche appunto basate su questi criteri che lei ha appena illustrato e che effettivamente potrebbero essere rivoluzionarie anche per un'università piccola e periferica come la nostra, per esempio aprendoci orizzonti importanti anche su piazze dove ci sono tantissimi giovani, da noi sono invece più vecchietti, che non hanno accesso agli studi universitari. Quindi uno di questi metodi è proprio quello dei MOOC, MOOC, Massive Online Open Courses, su cui Barbara lavora tantissimo e che richiedono però un investimento importante non solo da parte dei docenti, ma anche proprio di uno staff tecnico che possa supportare nel creare questi video tipo quelli che ci ha fatto vedere lei e poterli rendere quindi accessibili a chi non ha la possibilità di frequentare le lezioni, alternando magari delle situazioni online con delle situazioni in presenza. Ecco, queste sono un po' le idee che stanno emergendo, speriamo che il nostro Ateneo le voglia in qualche maniera sposare, anche in tempi di PNRR, quando ci sono risorse bisogna un po' approfittarne, e questo è anche un po' l'invito a chi di voi, immagino molti di voi siano insegnanti o aspiranti insegnanti delle scuole superiori, a fare un po' squadra con noi, perché il problema della dispersione scolastica nella nostra isola è gravissimo, si aggiunge al problema demografico e quindi così come stiamo perdendo studenti stiamo perdendo anche i pastori. È necessario sicuramente invertire la tendenza perché oltre che non avere più il clima che avevamo in passato rischiamo di non avere più tante altre cose che in passato abbiamo dato per scontate e che invece in futuro ci mancheranno tanto se non avremo persone capaci in tutti i campi e anche nel campo della pastorizia. Quindi grazie a tutti per essere stati qui presenti. Ora do la parola al professor Dettori per le conclusioni.
Sarò piuttosto breve perché voglio che torniate a casa ricchi delle sensazioni positive che ci ha trasmesso la professoressa Barbara Oakley. Allora, io credo che la cosa, almeno personalmente, che ha colpito di più della sua relazione sia la passione. E io credo che questo sia il motore per essere delle persone che apprendono efficacemente. Lei oggi ci ha dimostrato la passione che negli anni ha impiegato per fare degli studi importanti e credo che questa passione noi la dobbiamo avere prima di tutto come insegnanti e poi la dobbiamo trasmettere ai nostri studenti. Montessori diceva sempre con grande spirito critico che alcune persone e anche insegnanti pensavano che se uno si diverte non impara abbastanza. Noi oggi con la lezione della professoressa Oakley abbiamo scoperto il contrario, che per imparare bisogna appassionarsi, bisogna anche divertirsi e attenzione, questo lo dico agli studenti qui presenti dei nostri corsi, dobbiamo anche cambiare la didattica. Oggi ci ha spiegato molto bene quante accorgimenti noi possiamo introdurre nelle nostre lezioni. Le lezioni non per forza devono avere sempre le stesse modalità, ma arricchendole di contenuti diversi, di stimoli diversi, possono portare anche gli studenti meno motivati ad appassionarsi alle attività che noi stiamo proponendo. Di tutte le cose che lei ha detto sono tantissime che mi hanno colpito, in particolare mi ha colpito molto che tra le life skills per il 2025 sia stato messo l'apprendimento al secondo posto, siamo convinti che l'apprendimento sia qualcosa che serve per tutta la vita, che noi dobbiamo dare ai nostri studenti quella famosa skills che è quella di imparare a imparare, perché sappiamo che l'apprendimento è a rapida obsolescenza e che quando i nostri studenti escono da scuola e dall'università dovranno imparare da soli. E quindi noi dobbiamo dare non conoscenze che magari si dimenticano, ci ha fatto vedere tutti i processi dalla sensazione alla memoria di lavoro, poi alla memoria a lungo termine, ma noi dobbiamo dare appunto quelle competenze perché siano autonomi nell'apprendimento. Io credo che un'altra cosa, cerco di concludere, che i nostri studenti spesso, e questa è una critica soprattutto per gli studenti della triennale, i docenti hanno già una motivazione diversa, spesso si scoraggiano o spesso credono che l'apprendimento sia un qualcosa che si faccia senza grande fatica, senza grande impegno, senza grande determinazione. Spesso quando io mi fermo per esempio agli esami di qualche studente che non riesce a superare l'esame o che magari si capisce che ci sono, chiedo: ma che metodo di studio utilizzi? E io credo che per esempio alcuni suggerimenti che ci ha dato la professoressa Oakley siano importanti. Non basta leggere per tutto il pomeriggio o come ci ha fatto vedere quella persona che faceva gli esercizi il giorno prima. È necessario utilizzare delle strategie, per esempio quello della mela è molto interessante, del pomodoro, pardon. Il metodo del pomodoro è molto interessante, certo, è molto interessante perché ci permette di concentrarci, di fermarci, di riprendere, di non appesantire la nostra attenzione. E ancora mi è piaciuto molto anche il discorso di richiamare la notte prima di andare a dormire i punti forti delle cose che abbiamo appreso proprio per rinforzarle, per approfondirle. Credo che la professoressa sia d'accordo sul fatto che oggi le tecnologie possono darci un grande aiuto, sia come studenti che come insegnanti. Ci ha fatto l'esempio di Cauto e di altri che noi conosciamo e credo che tutte queste sollecitazioni noi ce le porteremo a casa e ognuno per quello che può potrà renderle però operative. Cioè io l'invito che vi faccio oggi è: non dimentichiamocele, ricordiamoci che la didattica e l'apprendimento è qualcosa che noi dobbiamo ogni giorno arricchire di modalità sempre nuove e sempre più efficaci. E nel ringraziare adesso la professoressa Oakley per la presenza, per essere stata con noi a Sassari, per averci incontrato in più momenti, per esempio oggi con un gruppo di tutor l'abbiamo incontrata anche per darci delle indicazioni a supporto degli studenti con DSA, a nome mio e del professor Ruggero le facciamo un breve omaggio ringraziandola con un grande applauso per essere stata con noi.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate the wonderful, kind thoughts. And I want to say how impressed I am with the visionaries you have at this university. It is really, I travel all around the world, and it is rare for me to find real visionaries. I want to give you an example of something that could lie in the vision for this university. So I know a person, he's such a great teacher that his classes normally had 3,000 students. They had to have police with crowd control because he was so popular as a teacher. So he thought, I'm going to put my classes online. Everyone said, you are so popular, you're so dynamic, you're so incredible. No one will come to your online course. But he taught online, he taught face-to-face. And guess what? within a year after he put the courses online, no one was attending his face-to-face. Everyone went to the online. Why? So convenient, so easy, and so fun. Really interesting, well-placed information, but also accessible to students. So the vision I'm seeing here of trying to also reach out to students using this new online modality, that is what has been successful elsewhere, and I believe that that can be part of the vision of a wonderful, much bigger future for the university here in Sassari. So it is my pleasure, and I thank you again for everything. This is a wonderful, wonderful town, wonderful university. I am so honored to be here.
Bene, la messa è finita, andate in pace, grazie. Buona serata a tutti. Ah sì, mi raccomando, ho pagato 620 euro per queste, quindi per cortesia restituitele. Ah, grazie, me lo sono dimenticato.
La moglie ti ricorda?
Sì, sì.
Ah, ok. Certo,
Grazie per essere venuta.
certo.
Sì, dobbiamo parlare con Gavino.
La studentessa.
Ah, non lo sapevo.
Sì, va bene. Glielo saluto.
Sì, abbiamo parlato anche della scuola di pastorizia, poi so che lui è un po' arrabbiato, ma ne devo parlare.
Ah, quando mai è arrabbiato?
Beh, infatti, ma fa parte del
Va
gioco.
bene, dai, di nuovo. Arrivederci, buona serata. Arrivederci.
Se qualcuno avesse bisogno di un attestato di partecipazione, io glielo firmo